Thank you very much, Soren. I'm going to try to share my screen now. And my opening slide. Let's go to the slideshow. Excellent. Can I just get Soren or Erika, if you can give me a thumbs up if the screen share is working appropriately on your end? Great, thank
Perfectly.
you. Thank you. Good morning or afternoon to everyone, and thank you to the PaTHES board for the invitation to speak today. It's a big honor for me. For those who are unfamiliar, I'm Ryan Eveley Gildersleeve, and I'm a professor of higher education at the University of Denver. The title of my talk today is Border U. I want to begin by acknowledging that institutions of higher education in the US and oftentimes globally exist in tension with Native communities and legacies. It is because of Indigenous sacrifices and hardships that we're able to be here to learn and share knowledge about education today. So here I have linked to resources related to ways that my own institution is addressing that tension. I want to express thanks to the PaTHES board and other members of PaTHES who've made today possible, as well as to some of my current and former collaborators. And just recognize that I don't think any knowledge is created in the vacuum of one mind. So I'd like to honor those who have helped me think through a number of the ideas that I'll present today. My interest today, I want to present a section of a broader project that's focused on migration, mobility, and the university. The broader project is entangling multiple lines of my inquiry over the past 15 years or so, bringing empirical studies of immigrant educational opportunity into contact with the more philosophical analyses around the knowledge imperative that I've engaged more deeply with over the last 5 years or so. So I call this slice of the project Border U. The overarching goal is to theorize an activist university that might fracture neoliberal confines and through such interstices affirmatively contribute to the knowledge imperative of academia. A working understanding of what I mean by knowledge imperative, I believe that the university is the social institution entrusted with as the steward of academic knowledge, and that the university generates knowledge through the faculty's scholarship of teaching, scholarship of research, and scholarship of service or outreach. As a premise to my remarks today, I want to recognize that neoliberal higher education is normative and irreversible. A ton of work has been done around this general theme, from early warnings of marketization to the competition of federal research grants, to theories of academic capitalism and new waves of knowing the university purely through economic explanations. I'm not interested in diagnosing neoliberalism in higher education. It's as ubiquitous as a Zoom room during our current pandemic. Rather, I'm interested in speculating beyond neoliberalism and asking questions about the possibilities of what might be next. As another premise, the university is a biopolitical project. In my history of higher education course that I'm teaching this term, in fact, I try to make two things clear. One, that higher education was originally and remains designed to benefit social elites the most. And two, that at least in US higher education, and I'm framing my comments because it's where I'm familiar, has been refashioned as one of the most powerful tools for social mobility without necessarily sacrificing my prior point of elitism. It's the biological dimension to US higher education, the biopolitical dimension to US higher education that largely supports these parallel, if seemingly paradoxical outcomes. This presents us with a problem. The knowledge imperative of academia is endangered. Measuring US higher education as a biopolitical project in a neoliberal state has led many scholars to recognize that academic knowledge is not in service to an egalitarian society as much as it could be. That the knowledge imperative increasingly faces infringements by political and partisan interests that truncate its potential. In context of neoliberal terms, this means our knowledge is truncated by its commodification, the institution's corporatization, our stakeholders' consumerism, and our intra-sector competition. Academic knowledge then, at scale, reproduces the biopolitical outcomes that neoliberalism is designed to order, an exacerbation of the status quo of inequalities. I'm looking to ask, how might new understandings of academic activism and the university itself help us strengthen the knowledge imperative? And I am particularly drawing inspiration from Latino immigrant communities in the Southwest and across the rest of the United States. Which leads me to a speculation that Latinx communities, immigrant communities, are the future of US higher education. Almost an entire chapter is dedicated to this idea in a book project I'm working on right now, but in brief, I'll just share that there are roughly 60 million Latinx immigrant families, individuals living in the United States today, with an 18%, that makes up about 18% of our population, a growth rate of about 28% versus 7% of the US population overall. Yet we can see that this particular sector of our demography really values education, as 59% of them are graduating compulsory high school versus 39% on average nationwide. And yet they get siphoned out of post-secondary educational opportunities. In the US, we have a special designation for colleges and universities that serve a large portion of Latino students. If 25% of the student enrollment or higher is Latino, we consider them to be what we call an Hispanic serving institution, or an HSI. They currently make up 15% of all public institutions of higher ed in the US, yet they're educating 66% of Hispanic or Latino students. I have a lot more to say about how Latino communities might be the future of US higher education. It's a little tangential to the rest of the points today, so if folks would like to follow up with that, I'm more than happy to later. I want to pause now and just run through a few slides and pose the question to you, what is a border? Thank you. We have more migrants on the planet today than at any other time in human history. We transport more things, longer distances, with greater multitude of technologies than ever before. The movement of people and things has become so important to our historical reality today that we wage wars over the movement of things, such as trade wars, as well as wars over the movement of people. Simultaneously, hundreds of new borders have been erected in the last 20 years. Hundreds of miles of razor wire fences, concrete walls, offshore detention facilities, biometric passports, security checkpoints in schools, universities, grocery stores, and airports. We are part of an historical era where motion, movement, and mobility, combined with division, expulsion, confinement, and elasticity, increasingly defines human activity. The kinetic nature of contemporary events therefore requires an historical ontology that recognizes the primacy of motion and circuits of division. Movement is not reducible to space and time. The new mobilities turn in the social sciences, championed by Scheller and Uri, recognizes that there is nothing that is not or has not been in motion. An ontology of motion builds on historical precursors of Lucretius, Marx, and Bergson. It shares influences from process ontologies and becoming, as each emphasize flux and becoming. But ontology of motion is strictly interested in the flux of matter, not space, force, or time. In a movement-centered ontology, force, space, and time do not transcend matter in motion. They are dimensions of reality, but irreducibly material kinetic dimensions. I'm drawing liberally from Thomas Nail's work, and he further critiqued his further critique of Whitehead and Deleuze via motion, matter, and history ultimately claims that process ontology and becoming fit very much in an Einsteinian paradigm where the universe is absolutely static, but internally and spatio-temporally dynamic, immobile, but creative and becoming, sort of a motionless voyage. Our contemporary condition simply does not allow for a motionless voyage. An ontology of motion, rather, as a complete inversion of ontology of becoming, wherein, quote, all becoming is rendered fully material, end quote. Stasis becomes an eddy or a vortex of flows. Thought becomes a coordinated rhythm of self-affective matters immanent to the bodies, brains, tools, and so on that compose them. Ontology becomes historical, grounded in the material conditions of its time. The methodological primacy of motion, therefore, is a historical ontological claim about becoming qua history. Thomas Nail earlier demonstrated his ontology of motion as he was developing it from his thesis of kenopolitics, the politics of movement, through which he examined migration and borders. In his books, Figure of the Migrant and Theory of the Border, Nail details various historical political developments by documenting ways that Western societies emerged over time via expansion by expulsion regimes. Expansion by expulsion is a process of strengthening political power by expelling those deemed unwanted from the body politic. At different times in history, this expansion was characterized by inward movement, outward movement, tensional movement, and elastic movement. Nail calls these regimes kinetic forces, each of which positioned the migrant into a particular figurine and was also accompanied by a prevailing bordering technology. For example, the border wall and the barbarian. Nail's kenopolitical project maps these movements onto kinetic forces and then along with various migrant figurations, border technologies, and resistance strategies. It is important to recognize that within a broader philosophy of motion, borders are recognized as always in motion, never static, never fixed, never quite knowable. Nail does a brilliant job at illustrating this in his book, but I do not wish to take the time to demonstrate here today. Suffice to say, borders are process. They are in motion. The acts of bordering is used to control, movement and constrain human activity. We have been territorially corralled, politically expelled, juridically confined, and economically stretched by the functions of our borders. In cultivating and illustrating how academic activism can engage resistance in an effort to strengthen and perhaps redirect the knowledge imperative, I'm going to review Nail's system of kenopolitics and highlight in greater depth the concepts of centrifugal force and the border technology of the border wall, and suggest a strategy of revolt for actualizing a border U. To quickly review the system of kenopolitics and the border and the theory of the border here. The fence is one of the earliest types of borders that Thomas Nail identifies. And he suggests that it establishes power by pulling objects into the state. So therefore, it exerts centripetal force. It uses a strategy of territorial accumulation, which requires an expulsion of undesired projects, an expulsion by abandonment, thus producing the nomad figure of the migrant. Three primary fence technologies were the corral, which was an offensive technology, and then there was the palisade, which was a defensive technology, and then the megalith, which helped to circulate power and the expulsion by abandonment. These are just really sort of abstract level overview of kenopolitics. I'm going to dive into greater depth of this one dimension here, and then I'll skim through the rest. This is the centrifugal force, and here we use the border wall itself as a border. Centrifugal force establishes power by pushing objects out from the center, away from the state. Its goal or its strategy is a strengthened political administration, which requires an expulsion of undesired objects, an expulsion by enslavement, thus producing the barbarian. Three techniques of the border wall include the military wall, which was an offensive technology that, quote, marches outward to expand social kinetic power at the periphery. Examples of this include the soldier wall, the soldier himself or herself, geodesy, controlling and understanding the movement of land on the earth, and the siege tower. The soldier wall will come into play later on as well. There's another technology was the rampart, which was a defensive technology that fortifies and protects the center. Examples here include the citadel and the territorial wall. And then there was the port wall, which was, quote, a regime of recirculation by controlling passage across and through the border. Examples include transport and city ports. It operates the in-between space created by the military wall and the rampart. And in the bottom left, I've identified three ways in which we can see each of these forms of the border wall happening on college campuses, at least in the US. We also have the border cell. The cell is a tensional force. It works through to build juridical networks of state centers, establishing push-pull relations with the state. It requires an expulsion by crazy sets of contradictory laws, producing a vagabond figure of the migrant. Three technologies of the border cell include the identification cell, such as a campus ID card, a detention cell, such as a study hall or a classroom, and a time cell, which is more circulatory, such as our credit hour that we often use. And then finally, there's the border checkpoint. The checkpoint establishes through elastic kinetic force and by deterritorializing or reterritorializing of the center of the state or of the institution. Its goal and strategy is economic dominance. It requires an expulsion by economic displacement or replacement. It has two technologies to the checkpoint. There are police checkpoints and there are security checkpoints. And down on the bottom left, I've identified things that I think might qualify as a border checkpoint in our practices of higher education today. So in summary, kenopolitics involves four versions of state power: territorial, political, juridical, and economic. If we can substitute the university for the state, we can see how the condition of Latinx immigrant communities in higher education might be explained as one of continuous, contemporaneous migrant configurations divided by various institutional borders. However, these mobile expulsions also render possible mobilities, and which Nail talks about as counterpowers through migrant movements and new bordering regimes that challenge the status quo. Migrant movement, it's important to recognize, is never unidirectional, and pedetic powers, the power of the foot, might help us to reconfigure US higher education. So here's quickly, oh, this is supposed to be a really long one, but I'm running short on time. So I'm just gonna dive into the example, which is to talk about the revolt of the barbarian and the border wall. The barbarian's revolt and the border wall is a seizure and reclaiming of land and event. It's a response to the centrifugal force of the institution that seeks to expand its power by expelling through a building up of the administrative center. In a sense, it's imposing assimilation through cultural appropriation. And here I want to draw on my ethnographic investigation of ritual culture and Latinx migrants in US higher education, where I closely examined Latino graduation ceremonies. Now, the institutional commencement is something most of us are probably familiar with. It centers the university and it seeks to strengthen its power by making students indebted to it for granting them the diplomas they receive. As a border technology, commencement itself picks up where convocation might have left off. The ceremonies are connected by the military wall formed by marching dignitaries, faculty, and graduating students. They each rely on the rampart provided by the dais of the ceremonies, and each act as a port of entry and exit from the life of the university. The traditional ceremonies concentrate power in the institution itself. We see this in the reference to songs of alma mater, imagery of the particular university through its crest, seal, or motto featured on printed programs, and wayfinding signs to the event itself. The traditional uniformed dress of those who process into the setting. It's very much a militant display of institutional power and control. The Latino graduation ceremony, however, uses the same skeleton of the ceremony, clearly marking it in the genre of graduation, but they typically will alter key pieces, allowing individuation in dress. They provide food for families. They make parents, elders, or broader community members the subject of the ceremony in significant ways, and they recognize the biopolitical aberration that the Latino graduates represent. That is to say, they know they are exceptional, that US higher education systems would not predict them to be graduating. But these dimensions to the ceremony, while adoring and powerful in their own right, also need to be read within the history of Chicano student activism, specifically El Plan de Santa Barbara, which laid out an agenda for Chicano higher education that included, among other things, increased recruitment and retention of Latino students and faculty, Chicano studies as a recognized field of study, and significant rituals and traditions to be built into the fabric of the institution, like the Latino graduation ceremony. El Plan calls upon the notion of Aztlán, an imagined unifying recapture of a thriving Latinx community. Altogether, Latino graduation ceremonies can be understood as academic activism via revolt and how they are remaking the commencement ceremony, centering family, community, and mestiza indigeneity, claiming the protest as place and more than place, but a mobile body, a movement from origin to imagined future, a revolt in how Latinx and Latino immigrant communities seizes the ritual of the commencement ceremony, recreates it in its own image, and imagines a future present wherein their ancestors are built into the designs of the university. The border making produced by the Latino graduation ceremony recreates the military wall, but uses the corpus of the Latino graduates marked by their cultural heritage and contributions thereof. They include a march of nations. They include a march of grads with families and parents. The military border wall, the soldier wall specifically, is pedantically reconfigured without university dignitaries or institutional symbolism. Rather, it creates a new physical and psychological border, drawing on the metaphysical imaginary of Aztlán. A port wall is configured in the crossing of the stage from Latino student to Latino graduate, which parents and children freely cross back and forth, pausing at times to share individual stories of struggle, survival, and achievement. These practices are in stark contrast to the institutional commencement that extracts from graduates more than it contributes. So looping back to Latinx immigrant students and academic activism in US higher education, the Latino graduation ceremony can be understood as academic activism and how it seizes the bordering technologies of the institutional commencement exercises and reconfigures them into pedetic forces of a newly formed border U, remaking the university to move outside its traditional borders, to move temporally beyond its institutional walls, like the bordering techniques used in the Latino graduation ceremony, persistently transitory and liminal. This leads me to ask a few sort of summing questions that I'll end my remarks with. What might a movement-centered, perhaps pedetic university look like? And what are implications for curriculum, pedagogy, organization, and governance? Such a mapping of Kino politics into the experiences and contributions of Latino immigrant college going leads me to a few further questions. How can we reborder the institution? What happens when we imagine and enact organizational change as a pedetic bordering regime, bordering as ongoing organizational change, bordering through pedetic force? And finally, returning to the knowledge imperative, how might pedetic forces strengthen the knowledge imperative through academic activism for the university? These are questions that make up the next two parts of my broader project. So I'm hopefully gonna glean a lot from folks' insights and thoughts around these ideas today to help me. So thank you very much. That concludes my prepared remarks.